In 1274 BCE, the largest chariot battle in human history erupted on the plains of Kadesh. 20,000 Egyptian soldiers faced 37,000 warriors from a civilization so powerful, so advanced, that they forced the mighty Pharaoh Rameses II, the great Ozymandias himself, to sign history's first recorded peace treaty. But here's what's insane. You probably have no idea who they were. The Hittites, a superpower that dominated the ancient world for half a millennium. An empire that gave us the Iron Age. A civilization that invented the peace treaty, mastered chariot warfare, and held their own against Egypt at its absolute peak. And then they vanished. Not just their empire, their entire existence was erased from human memory for over 3,000 years. Today, every schoolchild knows about ancient Egypt, Rome, Greece, Mesopotamia, but the Hittites, the civilization that shaped them all, almost completely forgotten. Why? How does a superpower, one of the most dominant forces in Bronze Age history, just disappear from collective memory? How does an empire that controlled modern-day Turkey, Syria, and Lebanon become so obscure that until 150 years ago, scholars thought they were a myth? Over the next 2 hours, we're going to solve one of history's greatest mysteries. We'll uncover how the Hittites were rediscovered by accident in the ruins of their own capital, why their language stayed unreadable for decades after we found it, what catastrophic event destroyed them and most of Bronze Age civilization in a single generation, and why, despite their massive influence, they were almost completely erased from history. This is the story of the Ghost Empire, the forgotten superpower, the civilization that changed everything and then vanished without a trace. This is the story of the Hittites. Let's start with a simple question. Have you ever heard of the Hittites? If you have, it's probably from one place, the Bible. The Old Testament mentions them dozens of times, scattered among lists of ancient peoples. The Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites. For centuries, that's all we had. A name in an ancient text. No ruins, no artifacts, no proof they ever existed. By the 1800s, most biblical scholars had reached a conclusion. The Hittites were probably just another small tribe. Maybe they controlled a few cities in Canaan. Nothing special. Certainly not worthy of the prominent mentions they received. Some scholars went further. They claimed the Hittites never existed at all, just another mythical people invented by biblical authors. But here's where it gets interesting. In the mid-1800s, European explorers traveling through central Turkey started finding something strange. Massive ruins, sculptures of kings and warriors, inscriptions in unknown languages covering cliff faces and city walls. The local people called one site Boaz Kale, but its ancient name was carved right into the stone, Hattusa. And in 1887, everything changed. A peasant woman in Egypt was digging through ancient ruins at a site called Amarna, the forgotten capital of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. She was looking for sabak, decomposed mud brick that farmers used as fertilizer. Instead, she found something that would revolutionize our understanding of the ancient world. Pause for effect. Clay tablets, hundreds of them, the diplomatic archive of ancient Egypt at the height of its power. Letters from Babylonian kings, correspondence with Assyrian rulers, trade agreements with Cyprus and Canaan. and dozens of letters from someone called the Great King of Hatti. Not a minor tribe, not a mythical people, a superpower. The letters revealed something shocking. The pharaohs of Egypt, the most powerful civilization on earth, were writing to the Hittite kings as equals. The language of these letters showed mutual respect, careful diplomacy, even fear. One letter stood out. It was from a Hittite queen named Puduhepa to Rameses II, the most powerful pharaoh in Egyptian history. She wrote, "I am your sister. You are my brother." Sister, brother. This was the language of equals negotiating a marriage alliance between royal families. The Egyptians left us thousands of monuments, massive pyramids, towering obelisks, temple complexes that still stand today. They documented everything, their victories, their gods, their daily lives. The Hittites controlled just as much territory, commanded just as many armies, and influenced just as much of the ancient world. So where did they go? Keep that question in mind, because the answer involves one of the most catastrophic collapses in human history, and we're going to unravel exactly what happened. But first, we need to understand who the Hittites really were. The Amarna letters were written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the Bronze Age, kind of like French in 18th century Europe or English today, so scholars could read them immediately. But the tablets found at Boaz Kale, at the Hittite capital itself, those were different. In 1906, a German archaeologist named Hugo Winkler began excavating Hattusa. What he found was staggering. Over 30,000 clay tablets, a royal archive spanning centuries. The Hittites had documented everything: treaties, laws, religious rituals, military campaigns, royal annals, even their own mythology. There was just one problem. Nobody could read it. The script was cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing system invented by the Sumerians. Scholars knew cuneiform. They'd been reading Sumerian and Akkadian texts for decades, but this cuneiform was writing an unknown language, something that didn't fit any known language family. Imagine finding the Library of Congress, but every book is in a language that has no relationship to any modern or ancient language you know. You can see the letters, you just have no idea what they mean. For years, scholars struggled. They could identify names, Egyptian pharaohs mentioned in the texts, Babylonian kings, geographical locations, but the language itself remained impenetrable. Then in 1915, a Czech scholar named Bedřich Hrozný made a breakthrough. He was examining a tablet that described a royal meal. The text read, and I'm simplifying the pronunciation here, Nu ninda an ezatini watarma ekutini. Hrozný recognized ninda as the Sumerian word for bread. So the sentence structure was, now bread, verb, water, verb. Her moment. He stared at the word ezatini. It looked familiar, not from any Middle Eastern language, but from something else entirely. In Latin, to eat is edere. In German, essen. In English, eat. Could ezateni mean you eat? He looked at the next word, ekuteni. In Latin, to drink is aqua, water. In English, water comes from an Indo-European root. Ekuteni, could it mean you drink? The sentence read, now you will eat bread and drink water. The Hittites, this mysterious Bronze Age superpower, were speaking an Indo-European language. They were linguistic cousins to the Greeks, Romans, Persians, and eventually most of modern Europe. This was earth-shattering. It meant Indo-European languages, the family that includes English, Spanish, German, Russian, Hindi, Persian, and dozens of others were being spoken in Anatolia as far back as 1600 BCE. It pushed back the timeline of Indo-European expansion by centuries and placed these mysterious people right at the center of the ancient world. But here's what really matters for our story. Once scholars could read Hittite, they discovered something shocking in the royal archives. The Hittites hadn't just participated in ancient history, they'd shaped it in ways we're still discovering today. Their legal codes influenced Mosaic law. Their treaties established the foundations of international diplomacy. Their military innovations changed warfare forever, and one of their kings, one single Hittite ruler, nearly destroyed ancient Egypt. His name was Muwatalli II, and in 1274 BCE, he faced off against Ramesses II in a battle so massive, so consequential, that it would determine the fate of the entire ancient Near East. Ramesses II was 29 years old when he marched north in the spring of 1274 BCE. He commanded somewhere between 16,000 and 20,000 men, divided into 4 divisions, each named after a god: Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Seth. This wasn't just any military campaign. Ramesses was attempting to reclaim Egyptian dominance over Syria and the Levant, territories the Hittites had systematically conquered over the previous century. The Egyptian pharaoh was young, ambitious, and absolutely convinced of his own divine right to rule. He was marching to destroy the Hittite Empire. He had no idea what he was walking into. Muwatalli II, the Hittite king, had been preparing for this moment. He assembled the largest army in Bronze Age history. Estimates range from 30,000 to 50,000 men, including warriors from every vassal state in the Hittite Empire. Trojans fought alongside Luwians. Warriors from the Aegean coast marched with soldiers from the Euphrates. This was a coalition force unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. And Muwatalli had something else, something that would give him a decisive advantage: chariots. The Hittites didn't invent the chariot, but they perfected it. While Egyptian chariots carried 2 men, a driver and an archer, Hittite chariots carried 3: a driver, a warrior with a spear, and a shield-bearer. This made them heavier, yes, but it also made them devastating shock weapons. Hittite chariot tactics weren't about shooting arrows from a distance. They were about smashing into enemy formations at full speed, shattering lines, and creating chaos. Muwatalli had assembled 2,500 to 3,500 chariots. Ramesses II approached the city of Kadesh, in modern-day Syria, along the Orontes River. His forces were divided. His lead division, Amun, was miles ahead of the others. And that's when the Hittites struck. The Hittite chariots came from the east, from a position Egyptian scouts had failed to detect. They smashed into the Ra division, the second Egyptian division, while it was still marching in column formation. Imagine being a soldier in that division. You're marching along a river, surrounded by your comrades, when suddenly you hear a sound like thunder. You look up and see thousands of chariots bearing down on you at full speed. The Ra division broke, completely. Men scattered in every direction, abandoning their weapons, their standards, their commanders. The Hittite chariots kept going. They reached Ramesses' camp. The pharaoh, the living god, the incarnation of Horus on earth, suddenly found himself surrounded by enemy forces, with only his royal guard between him and annihilation. Egyptian sources claim that Ramesses personally rallied his troops and fought his way clear. Hittite sources suggest something different, that Ramesses survived only because Muwatalli held back reserves and because Egyptian reinforcements arrived from the coast. Here's what we know for certain. The battle ended in a stalemate. Neither side could claim complete victory. The Egyptians lost thousands of men and failed to take Kadesh. The Hittites failed to capture or kill Ramesses. But the aftermath tells the real story. Ramesses retreated to Egypt and immediately commissioned massive monuments celebrating his great victory at Kadesh. The walls of Karnak, the Ramesseum, Abu Simbel, all covered with relief carvings showing Ramesses single-handedly defeating the Hittites. These monuments are so prominent, so detailed, that for decades modern scholars believe Kadesh was a great Egyptian triumph. But the Hittites didn't build monuments, they just kept Syria. For the next 15 years, neither Egypt nor Hatti could gain the upper hand. They fought sporadic battles, raided each other's territories, and competed for the loyalty of vassal states. And then something changed. In 1259 BCE, Ramesses II did something no pharaoh had ever done before. He signed a peace treaty with the Hittite king Hattusili III, not as a victor dictating terms, but as an equal, acknowledging mutual respect. The treaty was written in both Egyptian and Hittite, carved in silver tablets, long since lost, and later inscribed on temple walls. A copy hangs in the United Nations headquarters in New York today as the oldest known peace treaty in human history. This treaty tells us something crucial about the Hittites. They weren't just warriors. They were diplomats, administrators, and legal innovators who shaped the ancient world in ways that still influence us today. So who were they really? Where did they come from? And how did they build one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the Bronze Age? Let's go back before the Battle of Kadesh, back before the Empire, back to the beginning. Around 1650 BCE, in the highlands of central Anatolia, something remarkable was happening. Dozens of small city-states had dotted this region for centuries. Hattusa, Kanesh, Zalpa, Purushanda. They traded with Assyrian merchants, fought petty wars with each other, and generally existed in the shadow of greater powers to the south. But one ruler was about to change everything. His name was Hattusili I, and the moment he seized power, he did something unprecedented. He started writing everything down. The Hittites left us an extraordinary record of their own history, royal annals describing military campaigns, edicts explaining legal decisions, even something called the Testament of Hattusili, a document where the king addresses his nobles about succession and governance. This level of historical documentation was rare in the ancient world. The Egyptians recorded their victories, but rarely their defeats. The Assyrians focused on royal propaganda. The Hittites? They documented everything, including their failures, their internal conflicts, and their political struggles. Hattusili I was a conqueror, but he was also a strategist. He didn't just raid neighboring cities, he incorporated them into a growing kingdom, establishing a network of vassal states that owed him loyalty. He campaigned south into Syria, attacking the powerful city-state of Alalak. He pushed east toward the Euphrates. He brought Hittite power beyond the Anatolian plateau for the first time. But here's what's fascinating. Hattusili couldn't secure his succession. His own sons rebelled against him. His nephews plotted to seize power. The testament I mentioned, the one he wrote, was essentially a public disinheritance of his treacherous family members. He named his grandson, Mursili, as heir. And this decision would lead to one of the most audacious military campaigns in ancient history. In 1595 BCE, Mursili I became king. He was young, probably in his 20s, and he immediately set his sights on a target that seemed impossible: Babylon. Not a city near Babylon, not a vassal of Babylon. Babylon itself, the greatest city in Mesopotamia, capital of the Hammurabi dynasty, one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world. Babylon was over 1,000 kilometers from Hattusa. To reach it, Mursili would have to march his army across mountains, through hostile territories, past fortified cities, across the Euphrates River, and into the heart of Mesopotamia. No Anatolian ruler had ever attempted anything like it, and yet Mursili did it. In a lightning campaign, he marched his army down the Euphrates, bypassed or defeated any resistance, and reached Babylon before the Babylonian king could organize a defense. The city fell. The Hittites sacked it, took whatever treasures they could carry, and marched home. This raid had massive consequences. The Hammurabi dynasty, the line of kings who had ruled Babylon for generations, was destroyed. The power vacuum allowed the Kassites to take control of Babylon, beginning a dark age in Mesopotamian history. The Hittites had announced themselves on the world stage in the most dramatic way possible. But here's the twist. Mursili never enjoyed his triumph. Shortly after returning to Hattusa, he was assassinated, murdered by his own brother-in-law in a palace conspiracy. The Hittite kingdom descended into chaos. For the next century, nearly every Hittite king died violently, murdered by relatives, nobles, or rival claimants to the throne. The kingdom contracted. Vassal states rebelled. Enemies invaded Hittite territory. How does a civilization survive this? How do you maintain an empire when succession is determined by murder and every king spends more time defending his throne from his own family than from external enemies? The answer is surprising. You innovate. The Hittites developed political and legal systems specifically designed to limit royal power and prevent the kind of instability that had plagued them for generations. They created something unique in the ancient world, a system where the king wasn't an absolute monarch, but governed with the counsel and approval of a noble assembly. And this system, this experiment in limited monarchy, would allow them to build something that lasted centuries. Let me tell you about something remarkable that most people don't know about the Hittites. They weren't just warriors. They were legal innovators who created one of the most sophisticated legal codes in the ancient world, and it was shockingly progressive for 1500 BCE. The Hittite law code survives in multiple tablets, and it covers everything: theft, assault, murder, property disputes, marriage, divorce, agricultural regulations, and even animal husbandry. But here's what makes it special. Unlike Hammurabi's code, which emphasized harsh retribution, an eye for an eye, Hittite law focused on compensation and rehabilitation. If you stole a sheep, you didn't lose your hand. You paid the owner back, usually multiple sheep, as compensation. If you injured someone, you paid their medical costs and compensated them for lost work. Even murder could sometimes be settled with compensation payments to the victim's family. The code explicitly states, if anyone kills a man or woman in a quarrel, he shall bring the dead person and give 4 persons, man or woman respectively, and let him pledge his estate as security. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about restoring social order and preventing blood feuds from destroying communities. The Hittites understood something that many ancient civilizations didn't, that endless cycles of revenge made everyone worse off, and that society functioned better when conflicts could be resolved through compensation rather than escalating violence. Think about what this means. In Egypt, the pharaoh was a living god whose word was absolute law. In Assyria, kings ruled through terror and brutal suppression of dissent. The Hittites, they had a king, yes, but he governed with the Panku, a council of nobles who could approve or reject royal decisions. The king couldn't just execute nobles on a whim. He couldn't confiscate their property without cause. He certainly couldn't ignore their counsel when making major decisions about war and peace. And this brings us to perhaps the Hittites' greatest innovation, the vassal treaty system. The Hittites controlled a vast empire, but they didn't do it through permanent military occupation. Instead, they developed an elaborate system of treaties with vassal kingdoms. These treaties were incredibly detailed. They specified exactly what the vassal owed the Hittite king: military support, tribute, loyalty. But they also specified what the Hittite king owed the vassal: protection, fair treatment, support against enemies. The treaties were sworn before gods, both Hittite gods and the vassal's own gods. This was crucial. By invoking the vassal's deities, the Hittites acknowledged that these gods had power and that their promises were binding. This religious tolerance was unusual for the ancient world. A typical treaty followed a specific format. 1. Preamble identifying the Hittite king. 2. Historical prologue, explaining the relationship between Hatti and the vassal state. 3. Stipulations, the specific obligations of both parties. 4. Instructions for depositing the treaty and reading it publicly. 5. List of divine witnesses, gods from both cultures. 6. Curses for breaking the treaty and blessings for keeping it. This structure, this exact formula, would later influence biblical covenant texts and become a template for international agreements for millennia. When Ramesses II and Hattusili III signed their peace treaty in 1259 BCE, they were following a Hittite diplomatic tradition that had been refined over centuries. But treaties and laws mean nothing if you can't enforce them. And the Hittites had a very specific way of projecting power across their empire. They had perfected something that would change Bronze Age warfare forever. Here's a question. What do you think gave the Hittites their military edge? Superior numbers? Better training? More resources? All of those helped. But the real answer is something far more specific: iron. For most of the Bronze Age, weapons and tools were made from bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. Bronze was valuable, relatively rare, and required specific resources that not all civilizations had access to. The Hittites discovered something revolutionary: how to smelt iron. Now, humans had been finding iron for millennia, mostly in meteorites, which is why early iron was literally called metal from heaven in many ancient languages. But meteoric iron was rare. Mining iron ore from the ground was common enough, but turning that ore into usable metal required furnaces that could reach temperatures of at least 1,500 degrees Celsius, much hotter than what's needed for bronze. The Hittites figured out how to do it consistently. Iron ore was everywhere. Unlike copper and tin deposits, which were geographically limited, iron was abundant throughout Anatolia. This gave the Hittites two massive advantages. First, they could equip larger armies without worrying about resource scarcity. Second, iron weapons, when properly forged, were harder and held an edge better than bronze. The Hittites guarded this technology jealously. Iron working was likely controlled by the state and kept secret from foreign powers. We have a letter from a Hittite king to an Assyrian ruler who requested iron. The king wrote, "As for the good iron you wrote about to me, good iron is not available in my seal house in Kizuwatna. That it is a bad time for producing iron I have written. They will produce good iron, but as yet they will not have finished. When they have finished, I shall send it to you. Today now I am dispatching an iron dagger blade to you." One dagger blade. That's what he sent. Not the technology, not the knowledge, just a single finished weapon. The Hittites understood that their iron monopoly was a strategic asset, and they weren't about to share it. But iron wasn't their only military innovation. The Hittites revolutionized chariot warfare in ways that shaped military tactics for centuries. Remember how I mentioned Hittite chariots carried 3 men instead of 2? This wasn't just about adding extra weight. It fundamentally changed how chariots were used in battle. Egyptian and Mesopotamian chariots were mobile archery platforms. You'd charge forward, shoot arrows, retreat, reload, and charge again. It was about mobility and ranged attacks. Hittite chariots were shock cavalry before cavalry existed. The Hittite 3-man team worked like this. The driver controlled the horses, usually 2, sometimes 3 horses, were yoked together. The shield-bearer protected the other 2 from enemy projectiles with a large shield. The warrior carried a long spear, not for throwing, but for thrusting at close range. Hittite chariots would form in massive formations, hundreds or even thousands of chariots arranged in lines. They'd charge at full speed directly into enemy infantry formations. The goal wasn't to shoot arrows from a safe distance. It was to break the enemy line through sheer force and terror. Imagine being an infantryman with a spear and shield facing a charging line of chariots. The ground shakes, dust fills the air. You hear the thunder of hooves and wheels getting closer, 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 and then impact. This tactic was devastating against infantry. It created gaps in enemy lines, caused panic, and allowed Hittite infantry to pour through and exploit the breakthrough. The Egyptians had to completely redesign their military tactics to counter it. They started deploying more archers, building mobile fortifications, and training specialized anti-chariot infantry. But here's what really matters about Hittite military innovation. They didn't just invent new weapons or tactics. They created a military system that integrated iron technology, chariot warfare, fortified cities, and vassal state armies into a coherent strategy for maintaining control over vast territories. By 1400 BCE, the Hittite Empire was at its peak. They controlled most of Anatolia, dominated Syria, and held their own against every major power in the region: Egypt, Assyria, Mitanni, Babylon. Their capital, Hattusa, had grown into one of the largest cities in the ancient world, surrounded by massive fortifications that still inspire awe today. They had created a sophisticated legal system, perfected diplomatic relations through treaties, and developed military technology that kept them at the forefront of Bronze Age warfare. So how did it all fall apart? How did this superpower, this civilization that seemed unshakable, completely collapse in a single generation? The answer involves one of the greatest mysteries in ancient history, the Bronze Age collapse. A catastrophe so complete that it destroyed not just the Hittites, but nearly every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean. Cities burned, kingdoms fell, writing systems disappeared. Entire populations migrated or vanished. And when the dust settled, the ancient world had changed forever. Let's talk about what the Hittite Empire looked like in 1250 BCE, about 50 years after the peace treaty with Egypt. This was the Golden Age, the height of Hittite power and prosperity. Hattusa, the capital, sprawled across 165 hectares, that's about 400 acres. The city was surrounded by massive stone walls, punctuated with elaborate gates: the Lion Gate, the King's Gate, the Sphinx Gate. Each gate was decorated with massive sculptures that still survive today. Inside the city, you'd find the Great Temple, a complex covering 165 by 135 meters, with storage rooms holding thousands of pottery vessels filled with grain, oil, and wine. The royal palace sat on the highest point of the city, a sprawling complex where kings met with foreign ambassadors, conducted religious ceremonies, and administered an empire that stretched from the Aegean coast to the Euphrates River. This was a time of relative peace and extraordinary wealth. Trade networks connected Hatti to Egypt, Cyprus, the Aegean, Mesopotamia, and beyond. Hittite merchants traded copper, silver, and iron for Egyptian gold, Cypriot copper, and luxury goods from across the known world. The royal archives at Hattusa contain letters discussing trade in grain, horses, textiles, and manufactured goods. One letter mentions a shipment of 450 kilograms of copper. Imagine the wealth flowing through these trading networks. The Hittites weren't just warriors and traders, they were also scholars and scribes who preserved and transmitted knowledge. The archives at Hattusa contain tablets in 8 different languages: Hittite, Akkadian, Sumerian, Luwian, Palaic, Hattic, Hurrian, and even fragments of writing in unknown languages. The scribes copied Mesopotamian myths and legends, preserving stories that might otherwise have been lost. They adapted Sumerian religious texts, creating a syncretic religious system that incorporated gods and rituals from dozens of different cultures. One temple in Hattusa contained what we might call an ancient library, hundreds of tablets organized by subject: mythology, rituals, medical texts, omens, royal decrees, legal documents, and historical annals. This wasn't just storage, it was systematic preservation of knowledge. The Hittites understood that writing allowed them to maintain institutional memory across generations. Hittite religion was remarkably inclusive. Their pantheon included gods from across their empire. Teshub, the storm god, borrowed from the Hurrians; the sun goddess Arina, possibly an indigenous Hattian deity; Shaushka, the goddess of love and war, also Hurrian. Even some Mesopotamian gods like Ishtar appeared in Hittite religious texts. The phrase "the thousand gods of Hatti" appears repeatedly in Hittite texts. This wasn't literal. but it reflected the Hittites' willingness to incorporate foreign deities into their religious system. Hittite religious life revolved around elaborate festivals. The most important was the Shum festival, a spring celebration lasting over 30 days. The king himself participated, traveling to dozens of different shrines and temples, performing rituals at each one. These festivals reinforce the king's religious authority while also binding the empire together through shared ritual. By this period, the Hittite Empire had developed into a sophisticated administrative system. At the top was the great king, the Labana, who ruled from Hattusa. Below him were vassal kings, who controlled important regional centers like Carchemish, Aleppo, and Ugarit. These vassal rulers had significant autonomy, but owed the great king military service and loyalty. A network of governors and officials administered more directly controlled territories, and binding it all together were the treaties, those carefully crafted diplomatic documents that spelled out rights, obligations, and consequences. The Hittite military at its peak could mobilize enormous forces. Some estimates suggest they could field armies of 40,000 to 50,000 men, combining Hittite core troops from Anatolia, vassal state armies, mercenaries from various regions, the elite chariot corps. This military machine had proven itself time and again against Egypt at Kadesh, against Assyria in eastern campaigns, and against various Aegean peoples who raided the coastline. But around 1250 BCE, something started to change. The royal correspondence, those detailed letters between kings, began to reflect growing anxiety. A letter from the Hittite king to the king of Ugarit, a vassal state on the Syrian coast. The enemy has destroyed our cities. Our fields are abandoned. Our land is in turmoil. Another letter mentions ship-borne raiders attacking coastal cities. Food shortages are mentioned repeatedly in late-period texts. One letter from a Hittite king to Rameses III of Egypt practically begs for grain shipments. It is a matter of life and death. Send grain immediately. What was happening? Why was one of the most powerful empires in the world suddenly begging for food? Who were these raiders attacking from the sea? And why were cities being destroyed and fields abandoned? To understand what happened next, we need to zoom out, because the collapse of the Hittite Empire wasn't an isolated event. It was part of something much larger, something that scholars call the Bronze Age collapse. And it's one of the most debated mysteries in archaeology. Between approximately 1200 and 1150 BCE, the world ended. Not literally, of course. But for the people living through it, it must have felt that way. In the span of about 50 years, every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean either collapsed completely or suffered catastrophic damage. The Hittite Empire, destroyed. The capital burned. The royal lineage ended. Mycenaean Greece, collapsed. Palaces burned. Writing disappeared. Population crashed. The Kassite dynasty in Babylon, overthrown. Ugarit, destroyed and never rebuilt. Numerous Cypriot cities, burned and abandoned. Egypt survived but massively weakened. Lost all territories in Syria and Canaan. Suffered repeated invasions. Archaeological evidence shows destruction layers in over 150 sites across the eastern Mediterranean. Cities that had flourished for centuries were burned, sometimes multiple times. The destruction was selective but devastating. Palaces and administrative centers were targeted. Elite residences burned. storage facilities emptied or destroyed. At many sites, bodies were left unburied, suggesting sudden catastrophe or complete social breakdown. Here's what makes this mystery so compelling. We don't have a clear answer for what caused it. Multiple factors seem to have converged simultaneously. Paleoclimate data suggests the eastern Mediterranean experienced a severe drought around 1200 BCE. Tree ring data from Cyprus shows evidence of significantly reduced rainfall. Less rain meant failed harvests. Failed harvests meant famine. Famine meant social instability. But climate change alone doesn't explain the destruction. Civilizations had weathered droughts before. Egyptian records describe attacks by mysterious invaders called the Sea Peoples, a confederation of different groups with names like the Peliset, Cheka, Shekelesh, and Luka. Ramesses III left us detailed inscriptions describing battles against these invaders. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. This is one of history's great questions. The Sea Peoples might have been refugees displaced by drought and famine in their homelands, mercenaries whose employment dried up when kingdoms could no longer pay them, migrating populations looking for new territories, various Aegean and Anatolian peoples fleeing their own collapsing societies, or all of the above. Here's what's fascinating. The Sea Peoples didn't conquer and occupy. They raided, destroyed, and moved on. Egyptian records describe them as coming by land and by sea, bringing their families and possessions. This suggests migration, not just military invasion. Some scholars think the Sea Peoples were less a unified invading force and more a symptom of broader systemic collapse. Displaced populations, disbanded mercenaries, and desperate refugees all contributing to widespread instability. Bronze Age civilizations were highly interconnected. They depended on long-distance trade for essential resources. Cyprus provided copper. Afghanistan provided tin. Egypt provided grain. The Hittites provided silver and iron. When the system started breaking down, it created cascading failures. Drought reduces harvests, less grain for trade. Kingdoms can't feed armies. Military weakness invites attack. Raiders destroy infrastructure. Trade networks collapse. No one can get essential resources. More kingdoms weaken. More instability. One of the most telling signs of collapse. Writing disappeared from large parts of the Mediterranean. Greece lost literacy entirely. It wouldn't return for 400 years. The Greek Dark Ages. The Hittite cuneiform script vanished. Ugarit's alphabetic script disappeared with the city. Only Egypt and Mesopotamia maintained continuous written traditions. The loss of writing tells us that these weren't just political collapses. They were complete breakdowns of the administrative systems that required writing to function. No scribes meant no tax collection. No tax collection meant no centralized government. No centralized government meant no large-scale organization of any kind. For the Hittites specifically, we can trace their final years through desperate letters. One letter from the last Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, mentions burning enemy ships at sea, suggesting naval warfare against raiders. Another letter to Ugarit warns of approaching enemy ships and orders the vassal king to prepare defenses. The final letter from Ugarit, sent to the king of Alashia, Cyprus, is desperate. My father, behold, the enemy's ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luca? Thus, the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us. And then, nothing. No response, no follow-up, no further correspondence. Ugarit was destroyed shortly after. Archaeological evidence shows the city burned and was abandoned, never to be rebuilt. Hattusa itself shows similar evidence. The city was systematically burned around 1190 BCE. The Great Temple, the palace complex, the fortifications all show destruction layers. But here's the strange part. There's no evidence of a siege, no arrowheads, no bodies, no signs of desperate last-stand fighting. Some archaeologists think the Hittites burned their own capital in a controlled evacuation, taking what they could carry and deliberately destroying what they had to leave behind so enemies couldn't use it. If true, this suggests they had warning. They knew the end was coming and tried to manage it. The Hittite population didn't vanish. Linguistic evidence suggests Luwian-speaking peoples, closely related to the Hittites, continued to inhabit parts of Anatolia and northern Syria. A number of small Neo-Hittite kingdoms emerged in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria in the centuries after the empire's collapse. Carchemish, Melid, Tabal. They maintained some Hittite cultural traditions and writing systems, but they were nothing like the empire. The great Hittite state, the superpower that had challenged Egypt and dominated Anatolia for half a millennium, was gone. The collapse reshaped the ancient world. Iron working spread widely. The Hittite monopoly was broken, and the Iron Age began. New peoples emerged, the Philistines, probably sea peoples who settled in Canaan, the Aramaeans in Syria, the Phrygians in Anatolia. Power shifted. Assyria would eventually fill the power vacuum, but not for centuries. Greece entered its Dark Age, a period where population declined, settlements shrank, and cultural complexity disappeared for generations. The Bronze Age world died, and something new emerged from its ashes. But the Hittites, despite their massive influence on ancient civilization, gradually faded from memory. How does a superpower become a footnote? How does an empire that shaped the ancient world get forgotten for 3,000 years? That's the final mystery we need to solve. So here's the question we started with. Why were the Hittites forgotten? They weren't a minor civilization. They weren't an obscure people living on the margins of the known world. They were a superpower, one of the great empires of the ancient world. Yet for over 3,000 years, they existed only as a name in ancient texts that nobody understood. Several factors combined to erase the Hittites from human memory. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, which survived the Bronze Age collapse, albeit weakened, the Hittite state completely disappeared. No successor kingdom preserved their traditions. No religious continuity maintained their memory. No epic poems kept their stories alive. The Neo-Hittite kingdoms that emerged later were much smaller, less influential, and eventually conquered by Assyria. They didn't have the power or prestige to keep Hittite memory alive internationally. The Hittite cuneiform script disappeared with the empire. Without writing, there was no way to transmit knowledge of Hittite history to future generations. The Neo-Hittite kingdoms used Luwian hieroglyphs, a different writing system that wasn't directly descended from Hittite cuneiform. This created a break in written tradition. Hittite as a language eventually died out. Luwian and Lycian, related languages, persisted longer, but they too eventually disappeared as Greek and then Latin became dominant in Anatolia. When a language dies without leaving written records that people can read, everything written in that language becomes incomprehensible. Hattusa was abandoned. The site was remote, high in the Anatolian mountains, far from major trade routes of later periods. Unlike Egyptian monuments or Mesopotamian tells, which remained visible and were continuously occupied or visited, Hattusa just sat there, empty, gradually being covered by earth and vegetation. The Greeks, who wrote the histories that influenced Western education for millennia, had no memory of the Hittites. Homer's Iliad mentions peoples in Anatolia, the Trojans, the Luwians, but never uses the name Hittite. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, traveled through Anatolia and described various peoples, but never mentioned the Hittites. Classical Greek and Roman writers had no knowledge of the Hittite Empire whatsoever. The only place the Hittites survived in cultural memory was the Hebrew Bible. But here's the problem. Biblical references to Hittites are confusing and inconsistent. Sometimes they're mentioned as one of many small Canaanite peoples. The Hittites and the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Canaanites. Other times, they're mentioned in ways that suggest they were more significant, like when Uriah the Hittite appears as one of King David's warriors. For centuries, Christian scholars reading the Bible assumed the Hittites were just another small tribe in ancient Canaan. There was no reason to think they were anything more. Some 19th century biblical critics even questioned whether the Hittites existed at all, suggesting they were a fictional people invented by biblical authors. And then, in the late 19th century, everything changed. Explorers and archaeologists began finding ruins across Turkey and Syria. Massive sculptures at places like Carchemish and Yazilikaya. Inscriptions in unknown scripts, references in Egyptian texts to a great king of Hatti, the Amarna letters mentioning Hittite kings as equals to pharaohs. When Hugo Winkler excavated Hattusa in 1906, he found the royal archives, 30,000 clay tablets documenting centuries of Hittite history. And suddenly, scholars realized the Hittites weren't a minor tribe. They were a superpower that had been completely forgotten. The rediscovery of the Hittites revolutionized our understanding of ancient history. It proved the Bible's references to Hittites, previously doubted, were based on real historical memory, even if that memory was confused and incomplete. It revealed an entirely unknown Bronze Age superpower whose existence had been completely forgotten. It filled in massive gaps in our understanding of ancient Near Eastern politics and warfare. It showed that the ancient world was far more complex and interconnected than previously thought. Here's the ultimate irony. The Hittites documented everything. They kept meticulous records. They wrote treaties and laws and historical annals. They preserved their own history in ways that most ancient civilizations didn't. And yet, they were forgotten anyway, because documentation isn't enough. You also need cultural continuity. People who keep reading and preserving those records, political continuity, institutions that maintain archives and historical memory, geographical accessibility, sites that people continue to visit and remember, linguistic continuity, languages that people continue to speak and read. Break all of those, and even the most powerful civilization can vanish from human memory. Today, the Hittites are studied by specialists, but remain relatively unknown to the general public. Ask someone about ancient civilizations, and they'll name Egypt, Greece, Rome, Mesopotamia. Ask them about the Hittites, and you'll probably get a blank stare. But the Hittites matter. They matter because they pioneered diplomatic practices we still use today. They developed legal systems that influenced later cultures. They mastered ironworking, ushering in a new age of human technology. They created a multinational empire that managed diversity through treaties and tolerance rather than just brute force. And most importantly, they remind us that even the greatest empires, the most powerful civilizations, can be forgotten if the conditions aren't right for preserving their memory. Transition to final act. So that's why the Hittites were forgotten. Complete collapse, plus literacy collapse, plus language death, plus geographical isolation, no continuous cultural memory. 3,000 years of obscurity. But now we know their story. We've deciphered their language, excavated their cities, and read their own accounts of their history. And in rediscovering the Hittites, we've gained something valuable, a more complete understanding of the ancient world, and a reminder that history is far stranger and more complex than we often realize. We've covered a lot of ground in the past hour and 45 minutes. The rise and fall of an empire, the mystery of the Bronze Age collapse, the bizarre fact that an entire superpower was forgotten for millennia. But I want to end by talking about why the Hittites still matter, what they gave us that persists even after their civilization vanished. The treaty between Rameses II and Hattusili III wasn't just an isolated document. It established a template for international relations that we still use today. What made Hittite treaties innovative? They were reciprocal. Both parties had obligations, not just the weaker party submitting to the stronger. They were documented in writing, ensuring both sides had a copy and could verify the terms. They invoked divine witnesses, creating a shared framework of accountability. They specified dispute resolution mechanisms. What happens if one side accuses the other of violations? The persistence. This treaty structure influenced biblical covenant theology. The structure of covenants in the Hebrew Bible mirrors Hittite treaty formulae. Later, ancient Near Eastern diplomacy, modern international law, the concept of binding treaties between equal sovereign powers. A copy of the Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty hangs in the UN headquarters in New York, literally linking ancient Hittite diplomacy to modern international relations. The legal legacy. Hittite legal innovations also left a mark. Their emphasis on compensation rather than retribution influenced later legal systems. Their concept of proportional response to crimes, that punishment should fit the offense, became a foundation of legal thought. Their written law codes helped establish the principle that law should be codified, public, and consistently applied rather than arbitrary royal decree. The technological legacy. The Hittite iron monopoly eventually broke, but that's actually their greatest technological legacy. When the Hittite state collapsed, Ironworking knowledge spread throughout the Mediterranean and Near East. The Iron Age. The Iron Age, the period after the Bronze Age collapse, is named for the widespread adoption of iron technology that the Hittites had pioneered. Iron was more abundant than bronze's component metals, copper and tin, which meant more people could access metal tools and weapons, armies could be equipped more cheaply, agriculture could be more productive with better iron tools. The democratization of metal technology, made possible by the collapse of the Hittite monopoly, reshaped human civilization. The religious legacy. Hittite religious practices also left traces. Their syncretic approach to religion, incorporating gods from conquered peoples rather than suppressing them, influenced later empires, especially the Persians. Their concept of the king as chief priest, but not a divine being, influenced political theology in the ancient Near East. Their elaborate religious festivals and processions influenced later Near Eastern and Mediterranean religious practices. The architectural legacy. Hittite architectural innovations persisted. Their fortification techniques, massive stone walls, elaborate gateways, defensive architecture, influenced later Anatolian and Near Eastern military architecture. Their lion gate sculptures inspired similar monumental entrances in Assyrian and Persian palaces. Their use of monumental sculpture for royal propaganda became standard practice in the ancient Near East. The historical legacy. Perhaps most importantly, the Hittites gave us something conceptual. They demonstrated that history is more complex than we think. They remind us that historical memory is fragile. They show us that even the most powerful civilizations can vanish from human consciousness. The cautionary tale. The Hittites are a warning. Power is temporary. Empires fall. Knowledge can be lost. Even the greatest achievements can be forgotten if we don't actively preserve them. The hopeful message. But they're also a hopeful story. Lost knowledge can be recovered. Forgotten civilizations can be rediscovered. The work of archaeologists, linguists, and historians can resurrect entire worlds from the dust. Transition. So what have we learned? What does the story of the Hittites teach us about history, memory, and human civilization? Let's wrap up with some final thoughts. Chapter 11. The Ghost Empire and What It Teaches Us. 113, 120. Final reflective tone. 2 hours ago, I asked you a question. Have you ever heard of the Hittites? Maybe you had a name in the Bible, a footnote in a history book. Now you know them as they really were, one of the great superpowers of the ancient world, rivals to Egypt, masters of diplomacy, iron, and chariot warfare, creators of a sophisticated legal system and a multinational empire that lasted half a millennium. The core mystery resolved. And you know why they were forgotten. Complete political collapse, loss of writing and language, geographical isolation of their capital, no continuous cultural memory linking them to later civilizations. Classical civilizations, Greece and Rome, that dominated Western education had no knowledge of them. The broader lesson, Theme 1. But the Hittites teach us something bigger than their own story. History is not inevitable. The civilizations we remember aren't necessarily the most important or influential. They're the ones that happen to maintain cultural continuity. Egypt is remembered Because Egyptian civilization persisted in various forms for 3,000 years, and Greek and Roman writers were fascinated by it. Greece is remembered because Greek culture was inherited and celebrated by Rome, and Roman culture shaped European civilization. The Hittites are forgotten because the chain broke. The continuity was lost, and without that connection, even the most impressive achievements can vanish. Theme 2. Complexity is fragile. The Bronze Age civilizations were highly sophisticated. They had writing, international trade networks, specialized crafts, complex administration, and interconnected diplomatic systems. And they collapsed in a generation. The systems that enabled their complexity, trade networks, food security, political stability, were interdependent. When one failed, the whole structure came apart. The modern parallel. We live in a world of extraordinary complexity and interdependence. Global supply chains, digital communications, international institutions. The Bronze Age collapse reminds us that complex systems can fail quickly when multiple stresses combine: climate change, resource scarcity, population movements, economic instability, social unrest. Sound familiar? The balanced view. I'm not saying we're about to experience a modern Bronze Age collapse. Our world is different in crucial ways. We have better technology, more resilient systems, and greater capacity to respond to crises. But the Hittite story reminds us, don't take stability for granted. Don't assume that complexity equals resilience. Don't forget that civilizations, even great ones, can fail. Theme 3. Memory requires active preservation. The Hittites documented their history extensively. They wrote thousands of tablets. They carved monuments. They created archives. And they were still forgotten. Because documentation alone isn't enough. You need people who read and transmit that knowledge, institutions that preserve and value historical records, cultural practices that maintain connection to the past, physical accessibility to sites and materials. The responsibility. We have a responsibility to preserve knowledge, not just for ourselves, but for future generations who might otherwise lose access to it. Digital preservation, archaeological conservation, historical education. These aren't luxuries, they're essential practices that keep us connected to the human past. Theme 4. Great powers are not immortal. The Hittites thought they were permanent. Every civilization does. The Egyptians believed their civilization was eternal, and in some ways, they were right. Egyptian civilization lasted 3,000 years, but even Egypt fell eventually. The Romans believed they had built something that would last forever. Roma Aeterna, eternal Rome. It didn't. The humility. Every empire, every superpower, every dominant civilization eventually declines or transforms into something else. This isn't pessimism, it's realism. Understanding this helps us value what we have while we have it. Prepare for change rather than resisting it. Recognize that decline isn't failure. It's part of the historical cycle. The final lesson. The Hittites were forgotten, but they weren't erased. Their DNA persists in modern populations across Anatolia. Their languages influenced others, even if they themselves died out. Their innovations, iron working, diplomatic treaties, legal concepts, shaped later civilizations. Their ruins still stand, reminding us of their existence. The beautiful truth. Even when a civilization is forgotten, its influence persists. Culture flows like water. It finds new channels when old ones close. Ideas spread even when their origins are lost. The Hittites shaped the ancient world, and the ancient world shaped us. So in a very real sense, the Hittites aren't dead. They're just transformed. Their legacy embedded in the foundations of civilizations that came after them. Call to curiosity. And that's why we study history, not just to memorize dates and names, but to understand how human societies rise and fall, why some civilizations are remembered and others forgotten, what lessons the past offers for the present, how interconnected human cultures have always been. The invitation. The Hittites were forgotten for 3,000 years. Now you know their story. You know about their battles and treaties, their laws and innovations, their rise and catastrophic fall. You know why they vanished from memory and how they were rediscovered. The closing. The next time someone asks about ancient civilizations, tell them about the Hittites. Tell them about the Ghost Empire, the superpower that rivaled Egypt, invented the peace treaty, mastered iron, and then disappeared from human memory for millennia. Tell them that history is stranger and more complex than they imagine, and tell them that even the greatest empires can be forgotten, but they can also be rediscovered. Final thought. The Hittites are a reminder that history isn't just about what we remember, it's also about what we forget and why. And in that forgetting and remembering, we find something profound about what it means to be human. We build, we create, we document, we try to leave our mark on the world. And sometimes, despite our best efforts, we're forgotten anyway. But sometimes, millennia later, someone digs through ancient ruins, deciphers a forgotten language, and brings us back to life. The Hittites lived, they ruled, they fell, they were forgotten. And now, because of archaeologists and linguists and historians, they're remembered again. That's the power of curiosity, the value of scholarship, the importance of never assuming that history has told us everything it has to say. The very end. Thank you for spending 2 hours with me exploring the mystery of the Hittites, the forgotten superpower, the Ghost Empire, the civilization that changed everything and then vanished without a trace. Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and remember, history is never just about the past. It's about understanding who we are, how we got here, and what might come next. The Hittites knew that. They documented their history obsessively because they understood that memory is precious. And now, 3,000 years later, their efforts have paid off. We remember them again.